Okay, we are discussing this evening the issue of the Trump administration as it will be projected on the international scene. I would turn in this order, Phil Gordon. How do you see the international relations, the international scene? Will it be more confrontational under Trump than under Obama?
So I guess the first thing I would say is just a few days into the Trump administration, we should be very careful and cautious about thinking we know the answer to that question. Donald Trump as an individual has been on both sides of just about every policy issue you can think of, including foreign policy issues, for the war in Iraq, against it, Libya, domestic policy issues. His administration is made up of people with very different views on big questions of the day, including Russia and China and Israel. And so we don't know how the process of policymaking is going to be. So I think there is a lot of unpredictability out there. But the one thing we do know, or one thing we know, is that the president himself is unpredictable. And so in that sense, in a world that is already turbulent, I fear that we're in for some real challenges and crises.
Michel Flournoy, are we going to see greater budgets directed to the strengthening of the American military might under the new president?
So on the campaign trail, President Trump talked about enhancing, modernizing the U.S. military, growing it in size and capability, and that's been the expectation. And yet, when it comes to the people he's appointed, he put in charge of his Office of Management and Budget probably the most severe deficit hawk from the Tea Party Republicans. This is a person who argued for huge constraints on defense spending in the past and endorsed the sequestration when it came to defense. So this is another example of Phil's where you have some contradictory signals. And we'll see. It's not clear. I would expect that he would try to increase the defense budget and put more in, but whether he gets the cooperation from within his administration and on the Hill from his own party has yet to be seen.
David Ignatius, if you sit in Japan on the one hand, if you sit in European capitals, if you sit in Middle Eastern capital, are you worried that the next or the current president is going to give you trouble, overreacting to situations, underreacting to situations? How do you feel in the outside world?
Again, as Phil Gordon said, we're so early in the administration that we're guessing. But I think people around the world should be and are worried. This new president, whatever else you'd say about him, is very impulsive. He likes to make demands. He likes to disrupt. He likes to propose things that we think of as outrageous. He suggested during the campaign that maybe Japan should have its own nuclear weapons. He has suggested on the eve of becoming president, didn't suggest, he said it, that NATO is obsolete, that the European Union won't survive. If you're, let's say, a NATO member counting on the U.S. to guarantee your security, you need to be worried when a president says NATO is obsolete. I think we have to be honest and say that Donald Trump, in these statements that are so upsetting and disruptive, lead people to consider concessions they wouldn't make otherwise. So it's likely, I think, that European countries will spend more for defense. That's good. There's no point in criticizing something that we've all been calling for, Phil and Michelle and I as a journalist. But there's a difference between pushing people to spend more for defense, as they should, and suggesting that NATO is obsolete. So people should be worried about that.
Michelle?
No, if I could just jump in. I think Trump, from his business background, he said openly, uncertainty, unpredictability is an asset when you're going into a negotiation. But when you are the United States of America and you're the leader of the free world, uncertainty is not a good thing for either your allies or your adversaries. In allies, it can produce very counterproductive hedging behaviors, and in adversaries, it can create ambiguity that may encourage them to test the limits of U.S. policy. So I think an eye towards laying out some clear parameters of policy early would be very important.
Can I add one thing on this?
Yes,
as well?
and I want you also to add your understanding of the situation which is going to develop within NATO.
Well, first, on this point, I think it's an essential one. If this is just Trump, the deal maker, staking out a position to try to get a better deal, then that's okay. So he puts pressure on the Europeans and they spend more. And he challenges Iran and they're more careful in their dealings. And he stands up to China and maybe they're give us a better deal on trade. If it's just positioning for a better deal, then it can turn out okay. I do worry about, though, the businessman comparison with the president, because it doesn't work always in the same way. And if you're trying to negotiate a real estate deal for a building or something, and you can't pressure the other side into a better deal, and you walk away and there's no deal and there's no harm. But if you're trying to negotiate a nuclear agreement with Iran and you take that position, then it can go badly wrong. If you walk away from a deal, then you get an Iranian enrichment program or a nuclear weapon, or you find you have to enforce it with military force. So that's my concern. There's a chance that a lot of it is just staking out a position for a better deal, but it's very risky in international relations.
Well, let's slice it. China, which happens to be very much in the frame of mind, certainly was not mentioned by name in the inaugural speech, but certainly everyone had China in mind when he spoke about they rob our industries, they took the jobs. Are we going to actual mode of war in the South China Sea and the Eastern Hemisphere, or we are going to just circumscribe trade war? What is the nature of the conflict with China in the next 2 years?
I think first and foremost, President Trump will seize a more competitive relationship with China, particularly on the economic dimension, and he will push hard for fairer, trade practices and reciprocity. I think where he may be underestimating is the extent to which China will not restrict their response to the economic sphere. It may bleed over into taking actions in the security sphere, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's vis-a-vis Taiwan, that may be very problematic from a U.S. interest and allies perspective. We've already seen that just in response to one tweet by the president-elect before his inauguration, the Chinese steamed an aircraft carrier right into the Taiwan Straits in a pretty provocative mood. So, I think this will have to be very carefully managed to keep it from getting out of control.
David?
I think that China will be an area of greater confrontation. I think the President Trump has made clear that he wants to change the terms of trade between the U.S. and China. You can make an argument that they've been disadvantageous for the U.S. And that there's some benefit. I actually think that Trump, by raising initially the issue of Taiwan, probably usefully put China on its back foot, made them anxious. I think he then took it too far. I think it's interesting that the Chinese response so far, after initially being very disoriented and upset, has been to be very calm in public.
Conciliatory. Yes.
They've sought to take advantage of the world's anxiety about this sudden change in America's behavioral personality as a global leader. So they're, as at Davos, Xi Jinping, the president of China, seeking to fill the vacuum that is being left by an America under President Trump. It may be that China ends up as a great beneficiary of the Trump years, despite Trump's desire to confront them.
My concern about this is the risk of escalation, whether it's on China or some other topic.
Unintended or intended?
Unintended. I have no doubt that there is scope and space for a tougher U.S. line, extracting concessions from some of our interlocutors, whether they be friends or foes. But when you do that across the board, there is a risk that in some case you get into an unintended escalation. So we get a tougher position on China. We take calls from Taiwan and we put a 35% tariff on their goods. Well, they can get pretty riled up too when you stroke their national security concerns, nationalism. And if they respond to that by, say, selling some U.S. Treasury bonds and affecting our stock market, do we then have to respond in kind and say, well, if they're responding by selling our Treasury bonds, then we're going to recognize Taiwan? And each side, once it gets so dug in to getting this better deal, there is a risk that it gets out of hand.
If I could, already today, Trump signed an order to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. This was a multilateral trade deal. It really was the pillar of the U.S. rebalance to Asia. And absent that, it will create a vacuum that almost certainly China will step in to fill to try to right the economic rules of the road.
My next question has to do with Europe and Russia. Is there a possible grand bargain with Putin? You, Mr. Putin, you do certain gestures, moves in the Ukraine, promises as to not to intervene in the internal affairs of allies with NATO, outside NATO. We reach an understanding on Syria, the political future of Syria. I will turn a blind eye to your bases on the Mediterranean, and you help me to convince Iran to take certain constraints, limitations on the involvement in Middle Eastern affairs. Is that possible?
Let me begin the response. I think that Trump does have that big vision. He's talked through the campaign about a desire to improve relations with Russia. It was politically costly to him, although it didn't cost him the election. And I think behind that was the idea of seeking resolutions of these conflicts. Grand bargain is the polite term. It makes it sound attractive, and our relations with Russia have been so bad that some improvement was necessary, is important. If you call it something different, if you call it Yalta II, and you talk about just carving up the world into spheres of influence, recognizing Russia's spheres and ours and our mutual red lines, it doesn't sound so good. And if you're on the wrong side of this new Yalta II, you're going to be unhappy.
Michelle?
My concern is that the objective should not simply to improve to reduce tensions. The objective should be to protect our interest and allied interests from, a more aggressive regime in Russia. And we all would like to see, less tense relations. But you have to put at the core protecting our interests. And I worry that in seeking to simply reduce the temperature or cool things down, that President Trump may make some concessions that would not be in our interests or those of our allies long term, and that he risks being played by Vladimir Putin and being put in a much weaker position.
Can I add?
Yeah, well, of course.
Just briefly, I think this is really important. Two things. One, Trump's interest in this better relationship with Russia, to me, is really extraordinary. It is so inconsistent with his approach to just about everything else. When he says, wouldn't it be nice if we got along with Russia? He doesn't take that attitude towards almost anything else. China, Iran, Paul Ryan, his adversary. Really. But suddenly, this one issue, wouldn't it be nice if we got along? Why don't we find a basis for our cooperation? It really is exceptional and extraordinary. I worry that because of that, it's not a grand bargain, which would be fine, where we get something and they get something.
It's a concession.
It's a concession. And you can get along with anybody if you give them what they
They
want.
right.
Yeah, but on the other side, he is under scrutiny by Republican senators,
Yes.
not by Democrats. It's Republican senators
which-
who are going to watch very carefully any concession.
They will, but that is precisely my point. He's under scrutiny because he appears not to be doing a hard-nosed deal with Russia, which would itself be under scrutiny, but systematically aligning the U.S. with Russia without getting anything for it. I think he'll do everything you said. Allow them to stay in Ukraine, certainly Crimea. I think he'll pull back on NATO enlargement and missile defense because they don't like that. I think he'll align with them on Syria without getting anything for it. And that will be the deal. And the idea of getting them to constrain Iran in the Middle East as a counterpart to that.
Yeah, and this is where I think you have to worry for Israel and Israel's interests is that you could end up with a situation in Syria where he says, okay, we're going to get some kind of ceasefire and peace deal in exchange for some kind of general commitment of Russia to fight ISIS, which they've never really done. And Israel's interests aren't even considered in the process. That's my worry.
It is quite a possibility that we are celebrating much too soon in Israel the arrival of Trump, and the deal maker may want to reach a deal at the expense, to some extent, of allies in the region, not only Israel. Not only Israel. Last question on Iran. Is there a possible way away from confrontation? 10 seconds.
Away from confrontation.
Reaching the goals by some sort of a deal with Iran.
Well, I think that's you made the key point that part of this rapprochement with Russia would include some understanding with Russia's ally in Syria, Iran. That's a very dangerous strategy for all the reasons that we just have discussed. Dangerous to Israel.
I think given the lineup of Trump's advisors, both in the cabinet and the White House, I think it's much more likely that they will pursue a tougher policy vis-a-vis Iran in terms of they won't tear up the deal despite the campaign rhetoric, but what they will do is they'll add cooperation with Israel and others in the region to push back harder on Iran's destabilizing activity and support for
Your
terrorism.
last word, Phil?
I agree with both David and Michelle, and I would just come back to the escalation risk. As they do confront Iran, Iran will respond, and there is a risk of escalation.
Many thanks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Looking forward to the future.